Good afternoon. Welcome to our second panel of our Transition 2020 Day, the confirmation process. I'm Patty Solis Doyle. I'm a partner here at the Brunswick Group and lead the firm's public affairs offer. The Brunswick Group is a strategic advisory firm focused on critical issues at the center of business, politics, and society. And we are thrilled to once again partner with Georgetown and my friend and former colleague, Mo Elleithee, to convene today's conversation on an incredibly relevant topic. On behalf of myself and the entire Brunswick team, thank you for joining us today. I think it's going to be a great session. I'd like to try and set up the second panel on the confirmation process a little bit before handing it over to Mo and our incredible panel. While the official confirmation process will take center stage in just a few short weeks, President-elect Biden has already named 8 cabinet-level nominees, outpacing his predecessors in making appointments. Some of these appointments include heads of state, treasury, and health and human services. A recent study by the Center for Presidential Transition found that in the last 28 years, the Senate has confirmed 95% of a president's cabinet secretary nominations. Right now, the makeup of the Senate is still undecided as we await the results of the 2 Georgia runoff races in January. It's likely, however, that the Biden administration nominees will face a Republican-controlled Senate. There's growing concern within the Biden transition and Democrats that Republicans will slow walk some top-level confirmation hearings. There's some precedent as Senate Democrats used procedural tactics to slow President Trump's pick in 2017. There's an indication that the Biden transition team is already preparing for a slow confirmation process by rapidly hiring mid to lower level officials across agencies. Historically, many of these middle-tier political appointees would assume their posts until well into the first year of the administration. These jobs do not require Senate confirmation and can ensure that the Biden administration can get straight to work on day one while it waits out Senate confirmation process. At the end of the day, the confirmation process is political. There is an art and strategy to getting nominees confirmed. It starts with selecting a strong nominee and then effectively managing the process to ensure a successful confirmation. And when it comes to President-elect Biden, we're seeing a few key trends. Most notably, the Biden team is prioritizing individuals with experience in government, diversity, and people who have strong track records and the experience needed to be confirmed by the Senate. During today's discussion, the panelists will offer their view and experience on the confirmation process, what the next 43 days may look like, and what we can expect in the new year. Let me now introduce our panelists for our discussion on the confirmation process. First, Sarah Fagan. Sarah was involved in the election and re-election campaigns of President George W. Bush and serves as the White House Director of Political Affairs in President Bush's second administration. Second, Chris Lu. Chris served as the Executive Director of the Obama-Biden transition and has gone through the Senate confirmation process himself as the former Deputy Secretary of Labor. The conversation will be moderated by Mo Elleithee, Executive Director of Georgetown's Institute of Politics. Please join the conversation on social media by tagging at GU Politics and at Brunswick Group. And for those of you in the Zoom room, remember that you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom. Please include your name and affiliation. And now, Mo, over to you.
Thanks so much, Patty. Thanks to the Brunswick Group for partnering with us on this day-long full of events. You guys are great partners and always love working with you. And on a personal level, thanks to you for the introduction. Patty earlier called me her former colleague. To be clear, she was my boss, and she was a great boss. So thrilled to work with you again on this. And Sarah and Chris, thank you both for joining us for this very timely conversation. I think Patty set the stage very well about sort of what's at stake and how the process has worked a little bit in the past, but I want to dive right in. Much of this conversation is going to be focused on that moment when the nominee is named, but let's start a little bit before that. And Chris, I'm going to start with you. Talk about when the president-elect is making his decisions about who should fill some of these top slots, turns to the transition team, hands you a list of names, I presume, of folks that he's got to vet. Talk a little bit about that process. And if I'm mistaken about that, please clear us up.
Well, first of all, Mo, thank you for having me. It's great to be part of this conversation. This is not easy, and I think that's an understatement. First of all, you want experienced, capable people to handle these jobs. And, people often think about, specific expertise in something like Homeland Security or healthcare. But first and foremost, when you're a member of the cabinet, you're running a really big agency. I think Homeland Security, VA have upwards of 250,000 employees. DOD is much bigger. So understanding how to run a large organization is often overlooked, but it's an important criteria. And then what you're doing is, in an ideal world, you're putting together a puzzle. And for Democratic administrations, and particularly for this Biden administration, diversity is a huge part of that. And it's not just racial and gender diversity. It is people who bring state and local experience, people who come from the private sector, nonprofits. And so it's a puzzle. And the hard part about this is that every piece of the puzzle affects every other piece of the puzzle. And I think the mistakes that often transitions have made in the past in picking people is you pick your first 10 people, and then you look at your puzzle and go, boy, this is kind of a white puzzle. Now we have to start filling in the diversity. And I think what is happening right now, and while the process sometimes gets complicated, is really sort of thinking at the outset, what do you want the whole thing to look like before you start naming people? And it's not just the cabinet, it's the senior White House staff. It is also the economic team, it's the environmental team. And so you have to cut this in many different ways. And then last thing I'd say is, does the person have a rapport with the president-elect? And this is something that Joe Biden knows well from his time as vice president. He, in 2009, was tasked with implementing the Recovery Act, and he worked very closely with the cabinet. And in many ways, he had a much closer working relationship than President Obama had at the time. So he's going to want people that he likes being around and he feels comfortable working with.
So, Sarah, talk a little bit about the vetting process, right? I mean, you've got to know a lot. You need to look at everything about each of these potential nominees' backgrounds. Talk about what that process is like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several steps to it. I mean, there's the obvious kind of, financial vetting that has to occur because all senior officials in government end up having to file financial disclosures. So the most important thing is you don't want surprises. We continue to see, we haven't seen it in the Biden administration or incoming Biden administration yet. So I think as a whole, the nominees that they have put forward have done well in the vetting process. So I'm sure we'll get into the controversy around Neera Tanden at some point. But, Nannygate, how many people over the course of history have had to withdraw because they've had some, situation where they failed to pay taxes on a household employee? It's all those types of questions that you have to ask. And they can be very, very uncomfortable conversations that, the president's legal counsel has to have with people. So you really need to go through a full financial vetting. You also need to go through a full character vetting. And you need to, and this oftentimes doesn't disqualify nominees, but you also need to do kind of a full press vetting, a Twitter vetting, so to speak, because you want to know when you put forward a nominee, whether he or she is going to have said something counter to what your proposals might be, or even more importantly, critical during the campaign. Primaries can be very, very heated. In the case of the last two presidential elections, there have been many, many candidates, and those candidates built teams. And the unsuccessful candidates sometimes have people that end up in the successful administration. So there's really a financial vetting, there's a, for lack of a better word, you sort of call it the sex, drugs, and rock and roll vetting that has to happen, especially at the cabinet level, which are all the conversations like, is there any extramarital situation that we would be surprised about? The one that has tripped so many people up has been around household employees, which seems fairly obvious, but it continues almost every 4 years to bite somebody in the process. And then, of course, the press vetting, which is what uncomfortable questions are we going to have to answer as an administration by putting forward a nominee who may or may not have said something, unflattering about our candidacy. That happened many times in the Trump administration. The president has many cabinet officials and sub-cabinet officials who were not supportive of him in the early days of the 2016 nomination fight. So it's really those three layers that you have to start with, and the financial one typically comes first.
Hey, Mo, can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
Because I do think what Sarah's saying, the character vetting is an interesting one because the standards have shifted over the years. Some of us are old enough to remember Douglas Ginsburg's Supreme Court nomination, which was which fell apart because of marijuana use. Mm-hmm. That is probably not a disqualifying standard now. Nannygate has disqualified people in the past, but if you sort of promptly pay now, that's probably okay. DUIs used to be disqualifying. It's unclear whether they are. What is interesting is in terms of the sort of public statement vetting, it used to be speeches you give. In a world now of social media, in a world now of 24-hour cable, people say and tweet and write a lot of stuff. And I think the next horizon is what is disqualifying in all of this noise that is being generated every single day.
Well, and that's a good segue to my next. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of it is disclosure, where people get in trouble in a world where Donald Trump has had the pen of Twitter for 4 years, at the highest office. I think, Chris's point is a good one, which is like the standards have sort of shifted in terms of what you can say and what you can get away with anymore. But at the same time, people don't want to be surprised. And where you will run afoul with an incoming administration is if you haven't been honest about something, where you've said you've paid all your employee taxes and you haven't. That's where it gets harder for others in the administration to defend a nominee.
So I would argue there's probably a fourth component to it, besides the three that you laid out, Sarah, and that is the partisan one, the political one. Because on some of these things, some of these factors, which party controls the Senate probably influences your strategy, right? Going back to what Patty said in the introduction, that this is a political process and you need to come up with a strategy around each of these nominees. Continuing with the case of Neera Tanden, if the Democrats control the Senate, I'm not so sure that her past history of tweets would be as big of a deal as if the Republicans are in control of the Senate. So maybe, Chris, you can talk a little bit about how you develop that strategy of shepherding a nominee through the Senate, factoring in who they are, their background, and who controls the Senate.
Yeah, and I also think it's the shifting norms in the Senate as well. The last time an incoming president faced a Senate of another party was George Bush 41. And I went back and looked, and I think 9 out of his 10 or 11 nominees were confirmed either unanimously or had one no vote. There was one defeat, and I think it was the first time a cabinet member had ever been defeated, which was John Tower, but that was largely for sort of personal reasons. And then the person that replaced John Tower was Dick Cheney, who was confirmed unanimously. So even if you look, so that was 30 years ago. So clearly the U.S. Senate is different. But even if you look at President Trump's nominees, we think a lot about the Sessions nomination or the Pruitt nomination, which were, pretty much party line votes. But there were plenty of people Wilbur Ross, Sonny Perdue, Elaine Chao, who were confirmed by overwhelming bipartisan margins. Now, again, you're right. I mean, look, regardless of what happens in Georgia, you're facing a very closely controlled Senate. The most important thing you have in the U.S. Senate is floor time, and the minority or really any single senator has the ability to slow down your floor time. And that's, I think, one of the challenges. Every nomination, if it is contested and the time is dragged all the way out, is time that you're not spent, doing other legislative business like getting bills passed along the way. And so I think, whether you have 59 or 60 votes in the Senate, as we had in 2009, certainly affects who you put up versus if you have, as the Biden team has, 48 or 50. That makes a big, big difference.
Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree that there's the game has totally changed. We're going to see a lot closer votes on these nominees just because of the polarization that we're experiencing in the country. But the most important thing a nominee or president-elect can do for his or her nominees, is to put forth people that are immensely qualified. There are people, that exist like Colin Powell still, and in the partisan places that we all find ourselves sort of being shocked by sometimes how rough this town can be, that are kind of above reproach. They're harder to find than they were 15 or 20 years ago, but that's the best defense, because those individuals will get, and I think Elaine Chao was one of them. She'd certainly been a creature of many cabinets, both at the high level and even sub-cabinet. She was very, very experienced. She obviously had great political connections herself with being married to Mitch McConnell. But those are the kind of people a president-elect wants to be thinking about. There's a sequencing to this, which is putting forth your best and your brightest first, also sets a tone. When your first or second, announcement is all of a sudden rocky, I think it makes it more likely that you're going to see rockier nomination fights.
All right, let's move forward in the process a little bit. The nominee is named. How do you go about preparing them for the confirmation process? What are your top suggestions, tips for the nominee? What kind of research do they need to do, the political outreach that they need to do in the Senate, and the role of the Sherpa, which is one of my favorite titles in all of Washington?
Look, I mean, first of all, you're being tasked to lead a very large agency. You don't have to go 4 levels deep into that agency, but you should at least know what the basic mission is, and you should probably know what all the different offices and the major programs. And so it's studying. It's nothing more than just studying. I'm always, amused and bemused when I see nominees particularly for ambassadorships come up and, they don't even know which one is the ruling party in the country. They don't know if they have a prime minister or president. I mean, that's just do your homework. Okay. So do your homework on what you're being asked to lead. But I think beyond that, it is really, I think, anticipating the attacks against you. If you've had a previous position in government, whatever you did in that position is fair game. Previous statements you've made are fair game. And obviously you will be called to defend your president's policy proposals. But I do think the advantage that nominees have at this point is, unless you've been at the agency before, you don't own anything that's happened at the agency right now. And I think what it does is it gives you flexibility to sort of stay with high level principles and values. And, you can sort of say more soundbitey. And even to a senator who's, opposing something that the agency you're leading is doing, you simply commit to, Senator, I will work with you on this issue. You don't want to own the problems at the agency, whether it's from the current administration or even the previous one. You want to stay high level. So really, I think the best preparation is to anticipate the attacks that might come at you.
Yeah, and
Go
I
ahead,
think
Sarah.
also, yeah, to owning the president's policies. We're at a time now where there's already a significant amount of focus on climate policy. There's significant focus on transportation infrastructure. Being able to speak at a deeper level than sound bites about what it is that you are thinking about and what the president-elect is going to be proposing is important. At the same time, you don't want to be too specific, right? Because you want to continue to commit to work with people and hear ideas. But, I think some of these individuals are going to have more difficult jobs than others based on sort of the, what's been talked about most in the campaign, what's been covered most in the press to date, transportation and HHS as examples. HHS is going to be you're going to have an enormous sort of crash course that has to occur, just given everything that's gone on in the world with COVID and the vaccine and everything else. So,
just a reminder to the audience here in the Zoom, feel free to start populating your questions. We're going to turn to your questions in a few minutes. You can do so at the Q&A tab below, and then someone from our team will let you know when it's time for you to come on screen and ask your question. I'm really fascinated by the political theater around this stage of the process. The hearings are less about actually finding anything out, right? I mean, there are opportunities for the senators to state their support or opposition in the form of a question. And we've even seen theater lately around whether or not the senators take a meeting with a particular nominee in advance. How important is that? I assume that all these nominees are going to still do outreach to each of these senators, but talk a little bit about that dynamic.
I think it's more important from an optics to say you tried than it is to actually to do it. I think, unfortunately, we're just at a different place in politics than we were. It's interesting, President-elect Biden, having been, such a strong fixture in the U.S. Senate for so many years, probably will have a view on this. I suspect that he will feel fairly strongly that his nominees, especially his cabinet and his DepSecs, do all those meetings. Now, whether the Republicans will meet with them all or not, I think is something you can't control. But my own view is that that members of both parties should take those meetings. These are very important jobs. There's a lot of very important issues before the country. It's not really in anyone's interest not to take the meeting. I think the one exception to that might be, Neera Tanden, just given the nature of that nomination and the nature of the concerns around her as an individual by many Republicans. They may just choose not to do it as a whole, but it would certainly be a mistake to not meet with the HHS nominee and Homeland Security and other very critical agencies.
Yeah, I would agree with Sarah. I mean, you don't want to give, no matter what the divide is in the Senate, you don't want to give any senator a reason to vote against you. And so it is appropriate to offer a courtesy meeting to everyone on the committee that you're going before. And certainly if you get requests from people not on committee, you should do that as well. I think for nominees, again, it's a little bit of a game, and for senators, it's a game. You're likely to have a much more candid conversation behind closed doors. But again, as a nominee, you don't want to commit to something, but it's certainly a good way to get some advance intel from a senator about what issue is on his or her mind, and for you to flag that you want to work with the people. That's behind closed doors. When the lights are on and you're in a hearing, it's a whole different environment. And I do think, just while it's good practice, I think it's especially going to be the case for this administration, because, this is a president-elect who has pledged to be the president for all people, whether they voted for him or not. And so he's going to want to send that message symbolically through his nominees.
Sarah, one of the things that we see, particularly with when there are nominees who do engender a little bit of controversy, is an attempt to rally folks around the cause, right? Taking it to the general public, rallying allied organizations, asking them to come out and support. Can you talk a little bit about that process? I know you did that for some nominees when you were the White House political director. Talk a little bit about that and how and sort of how important that is.
I think for the higher the appointment, the more important it is, because you're more likely to generate constituent response around a cabinet level or Supreme Court, which of course takes up enormous oxygen when those fights occur. I think it's helpful when it's germane, so when you have doctors and nurses and patient groups advocating on behalf of an HHS secretary or ag groups on behalf of an ag secretary, I think that is where the importance is. So you do need, particularly if you are picking somebody who is going to be controversial for some number of reasons, that you've got to have that lined up and ready to go, so that a Republican who may be opposed to a nomination or be inclined to oppose a nomination starts hearing from all the affinity groups that are important that, we're okay with this nominee, we could support this nominee. That can make a real difference in swaying some votes. And so those types of, kind of liaison efforts, the Office of Public Liaison in the White House would typically run those types of efforts, or the political office in concert with each other would run those efforts. And those are very important. I think on some level, are you going to rally, people in the financial space around a nominee? It gets a lot harder. So I think in that respect, it's going to be very hard to do that for Ms. Tandon. There's another side to this, of course, which is the partisan side that you mentioned earlier. There is a partisan piece of this, you're right. But when a president-elect nominates somebody that either their base isn't happy about, it's not just a Republican or Democrat thing. Sometimes it's an internal process that needs to occur where, take as an example, I don't know if he's going to be selected, but my ABC colleague, Rahm Emanuel, there may need to be an effort among Democrats to convince progressives that, hey, this is really important. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get a massive infrastructure, bill through, and we need somebody with this skill and this talent who can help us do that. That can happen as well. And a lot of times what happens on the right is on social issues. If a president-elect were to nominate somebody who's not considered socially conservative enough in an area or a job within an agency where a lot of those issues are discussed, you've got to really work your coalitions to either get them to say nothing, which sometimes is a success, or to at least be a tacit approval.
So I'll give you a tangible example. So when I was nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I did not have unions write letters on my behalf. It's not that I didn't have their support, but it wasn't what we were going for. We actually had business groups write letters of support, and attest that I was the kind of person that they could work with at the Department of Labor. And I also had Asian American groups heavily weighing in so that the senators on both sides understood this was a priority for the community. So it was understanding what you might potentially get attacked for and shoring that up with the endorsements.
We're going to turn to students in a moment, but I want to ask you a question, Chris. So far, most of our conversation has looked at this from the perspective of the nominee or the administration. Besides having run a transition and been a Senate confirmed nominee, you also have worked in the Senate. You've also worked in a Senate office. So I'm wondering if you can maybe take a moment to talk about that perspective, right? You're sitting in a Senate office right now, and President-elect Biden has just named a nominee. How are you approaching this? How's your boss approaching this?
Well, a lot of it depends on which side of the aisle you're on. I mean, in these partisan times, it will be the rare Democrat who will vote against a Biden nominee. In fact, I will predict it will likely not happen. But that being said, even taking the politics out of this, your office, your state has specific issues with every one of these agencies. So if you have the opportunity for a courtesy visit, or if you don't, there is no better time to press a nominee for some home state issue that matters to you, and to get that person on the record saying they will commit to doing it. Because once they are confirmed, good staffers will then follow up to make sure that happens. I think that again, regardless of whether you want to oppose the person or support the person, it's important to extract whatever commitment you can at the process. And then I think, as you know, we've talked about, it's the gamesmanship of all of this. It will not surprise you that 2024 candidates will probably start to jockey and use these nomination hearings as a way to prove, their conservative credentials if you're on the right, and in much of the same way that it happened in 2017, and with Democratic candidates lining up who thought they were going to oppose Trump, and understanding that particularly for some of these nomination hearings, these will be televised. It'll get a lot of attention. It's a great way to get some airtime. And as you said, Mo, these questions are really often not questions. They're basically statements that you're putting on the record for a different audience than what's happening inside the hearing room.
I've got some more questions and I may exercise moderator's discretion to interject them, but I do want to make sure we turn to audience questions right now. So when I call your name, you will be on screen, so make sure you are broadcast ready. And our first question comes from Brady. Brady, introduce yourself, tell us your affiliation, and then ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mo, and thank you folks for a wonderful conversation today. I'm Brady Marzin from New York City in the School of Foreign Service. And my question for you both is, what are your thoughts on nominating individuals from the other party as an incoming president-elect? Do they help the president get things done and work with the Senate, especially in the current moment, or do they confuse the broader transition effort and possibly even lead to infighting within your own party? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'll take a quick stab at it. I think it's a really great idea that's unlikely to happen in the current times we live in. I think those folks tend to be almost shoo-ins when a president-elect does it, assuming they're picking somebody, that their own party would accept. Their own administration definitionally is going to be, more on the moderate side. But it's just that we live in a partisan time, and the base of the Democratic Party, I don't think, is going to allow Joe Biden to do that, just like they wouldn't allow Donald Trump to do it, whether he wanted to or not. So I think that's a bit of a bygone, but I don't know, maybe Mo or Chris know something I don't know.
Well, I would say, look, we at least in the first term when I ran President Obama's cabinet, we had two Republicans, really probably one. One was Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, who wasn't a partisan, so that maybe doesn't count. The second one, which was the better example, is Ray LaHood, who was a Republican congressman from Illinois, who was the transportation secretary. I generally agree with Sarah. I mean, I think part of it is there are certain places where you can put somebody. Transportation is often one. I mean, that was certainly a case with Secretary Mineta serving in the Bush administration. Right. There are places you can put them in, but there aren't a lot of places you can put them in. And I think if you can find the right person, I think it helps at the margins. Whenever President Obama, and he would make a point to go address the House Republican conference, would bring Secretary LaHood with him. And I think particularly around the push on getting the Affordable Care Act, we ended up not getting any Republican votes, but it wasn't for lack of trying, and having a Republican House member there does help. But it is increasingly more difficult, as Sarah said, just because the partisanship and the number of agencies that you could fit somebody gets smaller and smaller.
Thanks for the question, Brady. Next question comes from Emily.
Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Emily. I'm a junior studying international politics, zooming in from West Virginia. I was wondering, what are the advantages and disadvantages for announcing nominees in the time frame and manner that President-elect Biden has, and what engagement can occur at this time?
Well, let me take a stab at this. I mean, I guess Patty said this at the outset. He is moving at a faster pace than the last two presidents have. And he has, and I'll apologize. I don't know how President Bush did this, but what President-elect Obama did was roll out these nominees in clusters. And so, we saw a Biden cluster around national security. We saw one around the economy. They're sort of doing healthcare next, I guess. And so it gives you a chance to showcase that it's a team effort. And when you have more nominees up there, it also gives you a chance to show the diversity of the team. I think that as a theory makes sense. And I think doing the nominees as quickly as you can gives you the chance to build support around them. One of the interesting things that they're doing, which was certainly not the case 12 years ago, and it's just because of social media, is they're actually doing videos now, often testimonials from the cabinet nominees themselves, and they're putting these things out in social media. And so they're very quickly trying to get out in front, show who these people are in a way that wasn't always the case with previous nominees.
Yeah, I think the Biden team has handled this pretty well. In part because there hasn't been significant uncertainty around this election, but there's certainly been questioning around it. And I think he's done a good job of moving forward and, trying to de-escalate any political tensions, but putting these individuals out, as Chris pointed out, in kind of clusters around issue topics. Thinking back, President Bush did also do this, particularly in 2000, and we had a pretty truncated period. Keep in mind, there was a legitimate question about who was going to win the election up until I think it was December 12th. So right about now is the time, or just a few days from now, back in 2000, was when this was a fully settled election. And so there he had to be much more careful about being presumptive. And but at the same time, he had a transition team working and had been, thinking through who these nominations were. So once he was declared the president-elect, he moved pretty quickly and did move them, many of them out in groups, just as President-elect Biden did.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, next question comes from Luke. Luke, introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to ask my question, and thank you all for being here. My name is Luke Henkel. I'm a sophomore in the college studying government, and I'm zooming in right now from my home in Indianapolis, Indiana. So my question has to do with like the stakes or the substantive role of nominees. I've heard it mentioned in certain news reports that who the nominee is often doesn't matter all that much because policy is frequently dictated from the White House. So I wanted to get your guys' perspective on, to what extent the nominations are just used to signal to interest groups or to signal like the direction of the administration, or to what extent they play a substantive role on policy.
I think for most administrations, it's all of the above. Yes, you're right. The White House is going to set the policy agenda, but a substantive cabinet secretary can have a big say in that, and he or she can certainly have a big say in whether the legislation gets passed, and how well it's articulated to the public, and building support for legislation. So, yes, there is a part of this, as Chris pointed out, there's a game that's going on, and there's a puzzle you're putting together, and to some degree, in most of those cabinets, there are 3 or 4, really great people who could do the job, and, probably 1 or 2 amazing people who could do the job, but not where it really matters, in my view. And I think Chris alluded to this, it's often overlooked, is can they manage something very, very complex and very, very large? Or is the administration prudent in the way that they configure a team? Because there are instances where you put somebody at a cabinet secretary who has limited managerial experience, but is an incredible spokesman or woman, and is really great at politics. But then there's a deputy secretary that is an amazing management, and that individual is allowed to do a lot of the management. So it does really, really matter. And oftentimes, there's a lot of politics in the nominations, but if you think it through, you can make it all work.
Yeah, I'll agree with Sarah 100%. It's everything you just said. I mean, yes, there's obviously symbolism in, what the person looks like or what the person's background is. But, if you think about, like Janet Yellen being chosen as the Treasury Secretary, yeah, I guess you're sending a symbolic message that it's the first female Treasury Secretary, but this is substantively somebody who has an unrivaled set of experiences and who can hit the ground running on day one as the Treasury Secretary. And as the former Fed chair, probably also understands how to run a big agency as well. So, a well thought through cabinet pick should actually check all of these boxes. And yeah, it is true that a lot of policy developments run out of the White House. But, we have seen really over the last, 4 to 8 years, 12 years that, who is in a cabinet, their ability to successfully wield all of their agency's powers can make them a, force of nature, even in a very White House driven administration.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up because you kind of just referenced it a little bit in this answer. I mean, all the cameras are focused on the cabinet members, but as you both have alluded to, those sub-cabinet roles, right? The deputy secretaries, the other Senate confirmed roles are oftentimes more important, but they don't get the same level of press attention or scrutiny. But that doesn't mean the politics is any less vicious sometimes, right? Sometimes it can maybe even be more so. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in getting a sub-cabinet level person through the confirmation process? Is there a different strategy when the cameras aren't focused on them as much?
I think it's exactly, you said it right. It's certainly, I don't even know what the number of positions that require confirmation is. The overwhelming majority of these are non-controversial. But there's a couple in every single agency, and whether it's for good or bad reasons. I mean, I don't know in previous administrations that the CDC director or the FDA commissioner would have been a high profile pick. It's an important pick, but obviously in a COVID world, it makes all of the difference in the world. The assistant attorney general is always an important and always a high profile and often a controversial pick. But, especially in this new environment, who runs customs and border protection is going to be a big deal. So a lot of that, so again, it's not everybody, but there's a couple of these in every single agency that ends up becoming a fight.
Let's go to our next question, and it is from Graham. And just as a reminder, for those who may be tuning in late, you can submit questions at the Q&A tab below. Okay, Graham, go for it.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank both of you for coming and speaking to everyone today. My name is Graham Hillman. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service, zooming in from my home in Bethesda, Maryland. And my question to both of you is, you both mentioned this idea that Biden has shown a pattern of picking people with more experience, like often career technocrats, rather than these flashy elected official types. And is there a reason to believe that this may be a strategic decision, and that elected officials would have a significantly tougher time making it through the confirmation process?
Well, I think it cuts both ways, actually. I mean, clearly loyalty is in the big jobs, state, Treasury. I do think I think Janet Yellen, I agree, was incredibly qualified, but that was an important statement he was able to make with her nomination. But that he has, particularly in the foreign affairs space, picked people he is, who he knows well, who he's worked with a long time, and who are not household names in many cases. probably works fine because there's not a lot of controversy around those individuals. But I think the flip side of it is, do they have the stature to do? They intellectually and experience-wise do, but do they have the public stature, to do those jobs? And I think you'll see those questions come from senators.
It's also interesting. Again, 100% agree with Sarah. I mean, I think it certainly cuts both ways. If you are an elected official, you actually often, have a certain stature. You probably have a set of relationships that might help you get confirmed, but you also have a record as well. And, increasingly in this partisan, polarized Senate, there used to be a sense of deference to senators getting, cabinet jobs. But that certainly wasn't the case with Jeff Sessions. And I think that probably was pretty close to a party line vote. It would be interesting if, these news accounts that are coming out, in the last hour about Doug Jones being a leader for Attorney General, whether there would be some sense of, some sense of deference, some sense of bipartisanship in Republican senators confirming him. It is often the case that governors are chosen for these positions in the cabinet, and in part because, as we've talked about, these are really hard agencies to run, and governors as former executives are often particularly adept at doing this.
Okay, thanks for the question, Graham. We've seen the president-elect roll these out in a way, as we've talked a little bit about, that also sends a clear sort of messaging signal, right? I mean, leading with national security and then the economy and healthcare shows sort of top priorities for an incoming administration. But once the nominations go to the Senate, it's then up to the Senate to decide the order and the process moving forward. So I'm wondering if you can shed any light on sort of the time frame and sort of how the Senate might approach approving or holding hearings and voting on some of these.
So what typically happens is when the Senate comes back on, I think it's January 3rd, although I think that falls on a Sunday this year, January 4th. Technically, it's not a nomination hearing because only the president can nominate somebody, but the Senate will do courtesy hearings that are functionally confirmation hearings for the nominees. Those typically will happen, maybe the week leading into Inauguration Day. That's when they would happen. And then, as soon as the president-elect is sworn in, becomes the president, he signs the papers that send up the nominations formally, and the Senate would vote on them. And it's not, I think in most administrations, there's a handful or two, maybe it's a handful that are confirmed the day after, that are quickly confirmed by a voice vote or roll call vote right after Inauguration Day. But there are always a couple that drag out. There are a couple that drag out because it gets more complicated, or they run into problems, or as Sarah's mentioned, there's tax issues that slow things down, or a senator puts a hold on it, and decides they want a roll call vote. So, but you would typically have most of your cabinet done, let's say the beginning of February, but, inevitably there's one or two that drag out for months after that.
Right. I mean, we all remember Sally Yates was the acting attorney general for at least several weeks into the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on the end of our time. Sarah, thinking about the Republicans in the Senate, should they maintain control after the Georgia special election, do you foresee them? What do you think their approach is going to be? Do you think they're going to give the president-elect most of his nominees, or do you think they will try to knock out a couple of them?
So, I'll come back to Neera Tanden. So the individuals nominated to date, I don't think are particularly controversial. I think Yellen will be confirmed quickly, I suspect, just given his relationship with the Secretary of State nominee, that they'll have hearings, but give Biden what he wants on that. And, you know, I don't foresee anyone else being overly controversial, at least to date. The one exception I think you'll see a lot of conversation around is HHS, just given what's going on in the world. And, you know, I think Republicans will want to, you know, setting Donald Trump's Twitter feed aside, I think Republicans will want to lay down some markers around what's been done to date around the vaccine. And, you know, where will the HHS secretary be coming from in terms of rollout and mandates? And there'll be questions around, you know, do you have to take the vaccine if you're going to go back to a public school, for example, even though there's been no testing on children? Is that something we're going to require a year from now? There's going to be a lot of questions, and I think that will be a particularly tricky nomination, just given the nature of the time that we're in. I think Neera Tanden will have a very difficult time getting through. I think that has been kind of the one blind spot from, you know, the Biden team, which is they really seemed unprepared for that, and were surprised by the reaction. And they simply had to just talk to almost any Republican who would have told them that that was a bad idea politically. So I think she will have a very difficult time getting through if Republicans do in fact retain the Senate.
And Chris, from your perspective, I know you've been somewhat involved on one of the agency reviews, but not asking you to speak on behalf of the Biden transition. I guess my last question to you is, what do you think the biggest pitfalls are for a transition between now and Inauguration Day, and sort of best advice you can give to avoid that?
It's the limitations of time. And Sarah knows this full well, and she just explained it. I mean, you simply go back to 2000, having a transition that was shortened by, you know, 5 or 6 weeks, that limits your ability to, you know, vet your nominees, announce them, get your policies in place. It's not to say that things don't happen, you know, behind the scenes. I think the several week delay in ascertainment has an impact. I think that impact can be overcome. But people forget during a transition, this is a really delicate, and it needs to operate like clockwork. There needs to really be hand in glove cooperation between the outgoing administration and the incoming one. It's not just about, you know, it's not just about the success of the Biden administration, but particularly in this period of time when we're dealing with, you know, an economic recession, we're dealing with vaccine development and distribution. You want to make sure that whatever's the case and happening on January 19th doesn't change on January 20th. We also know, frankly, that transition periods can be vulnerable times from a homeland security perspective, a national security perspective. And you want both sides talking openly, continuously about what is happening. And, you know, going back to 2009, and it wasn't reported at the time, but there was a threat of an attack on Obama's swearing in, and it required, you know, Condoleezza Rice on one side and Hillary Clinton on the other side having conversations before Election Day. And it's one of the reasons, if you look, why Michael Chertoff stayed as the Homeland Security Secretary for a day into the Obama administration, because they wanted to ensure continuity of government. And that was, you know, with an outgoing administration and President Bush, who, you know, could not have been more cooperative and gracious and welcoming to us. And so I hope whatever's happening right now with, you know, President Trump and his contesting of this election, I think ceases at some point, because that cooperation needs to happen at the highest levels of government.
Chris and Sarah, thank you both so much for spending some time with us today and for sharing your insights. Thanks again to the Brunswick Group for the tremendous partnership on this whole day. And thanks to all of you who tuned in for spending part of your day with us. Come back in about an hour, where we'll have our final conversation on setting a new agenda featuring Steph Feldman, the policy director for the Biden presidential campaign in conversation with Yamiche Alcindor from PBS and more importantly, AHOYA herself. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.